Mprus here, founder and chief investment officer of Scale Investment Group, a boutique investment management firm in Southeast Michigan. There's a word that you probably heard over the last couple months as the election was ramping up, and no doubt you're going to hear more about it in the next 2 months as we approach the inauguration, and certainly during the Trump presidency that's going to follow the inauguration, Trump Part 2. You'll probably be hearing this word a lot. And the word, of course, is tariff or tariffs. It's a big word, a beautiful word. Some might say the best. But I'm not one of those people. I don't think tariffs are all that great. And I have the receipts to back it up. Now, they don't necessarily have to be an absolute killer and terrible. There is some nuance there, and we'll try and get into some of that in this discussion. But generally, a tax is ultimately paid by somebody. And a tariff is just a tax on imported goods, whether they're coming across the bridge from Canada or they're coming by sea all the way from the other side of the world from China. Now, of course, tariffs are not unilateral in terms of how they apply, what countries they apply to, what industries they apply to. That's kind of tailored specifically by each administration. Anytime new tariffs are proposed or taken off the books or negotiated, whatever the case may be. And it's not a partisan issue. Both parties, Republicans and Democrats, have at various times supported and proposed tariffs, whether broad-based or for specific industries, and we'll get into some examples. Let's take a look real quickly at a made-up scenario. You've got the option of buying an item, whatever the item may be. These are, similar, comparable items. If you buy one, you don't need the other, and vice versa. So there's no scenario in which you'd need two of these, right? And you're trying to decide which one to buy. Well, this one is made domestically, right here in the United States, maybe right in Detroit, right in your backyard. It costs $100, okay? This one over here is a comparable unit. It has most of the same features. You're probably okay buying either one, but it only costs $60, okay? Well, if price is a major consideration for you, and for a lot of people it is, especially with recent inflation, and you're not too concerned about where the country of origin is, where this item was made, then all things being equal otherwise, you're probably going to go for the $60 item versus the $100 item, okay? So two things happened right there. You saved yourself 40 bucks, good job, right? But you're also disadvantaging, if that's a word, the US manufacturer of that product. Now, the US product might be $40 more expensive for a good reason, right? But it also may be an inferior product with just higher rates that are being paid to workers, right? So you're not getting necessarily a better product, maybe even a worse product, but it just costs more to make it in the United States than it does to make something comparable in China. Because we all know that they pay their workers a lot less, right? So that's the scenario right there. Now, let's imagine that this imported product from China has a 100% tariff or tax applied to it, right? So now you've got two options. You've got the US option, costs $100 still, right? Or you've got the made in China option, which is not $60 anymore, it's $120, right? Now, no matter which option you pick, it's going to cost you more. In fact, it's going to cost you at least $40 more. Or if you go with the made in China one, it's going to cost you $60 or double what it cost you before. Because those costs always are going to be passed on to the consumer. There's no company that is operating on, reasonable margins that's going to be able to eat a 100% tariff. Now, the tariffs are not necessarily going to be 100%, but for this example, that's the number we're going with. So the amount of the tariff does make a difference. Tom Woods, who's a great podcaster, and he's got a channel on YouTube, The Great Tom Woods, did an episode talking about tariffs recently. I encourage you to check it out. I'll link to his channel in the description box below. He used the example of steel industry. So steel has been a protected industry for many years, right? And we always want to, make steel here domestically because it's important for the war effort during World War II. Obviously, it costs a lot of money to ship steel overseas because it's heavy. Even with that, a lot of it is made outside of the US. In fact, we ship a lot of our scrap overseas for them to smelt down and bring it back as raw materials in some cases. But he gave the example of the steel industry. So by placing tariffs on imported steel, you might save X number of jobs in the steel industry, but there's a lot of industries that depend on that steel as inputs for their eventual output. Let's say you're making, I don't know, trailers, right? Well, the trailer has a frame, and the frame is made out of steel. Now, if the costs of your inputs go up, then you're going to have to figure out either a way to cut your costs or pass those costs along to the consumer, right? And there's a thing called elasticity in economics. Some industries are more elastic and others are less elastic. And the idea behind that is you can pass on certain costs to consumers because they have no choice, right? They're going to continue buying your products because they need it, or there's no getting around. There's no alternatives, right? Whereas if you're at the store and you're buying fruits and the price of bananas has tripled, well, you can just buy apples or oranges or kiwis or pineapples or whatever else, right? They're not exactly replaceable one for one, but they are complementary goods in that respect. So he gave the example of steel tariffs, right? If you're a trailer manufacturer, now you may or may not be able to pass all of those costs on to consumers, so you may have to impartedly start cutting costs. And that may come in the way of actually firing people, right? So here you've saved 100,000 steelworker jobs, but the cost might be 300,000 other industry jobs, which don't very clearly and easily show up in the Department of, Bureau of Labor Statistics, or whoever puts together the unemployment numbers and the breakdowns by category and by industry and all of that. And to give you an example, a real world example, this happened during Obama part one, the 2008 administration starting then. He implemented tariffs on tires that were being imported from China because domestic tire manufacturers could not compete on price. Now, those tariffs actually were only in place for a couple of years and they were phased out by 2012, but the damage has already been done. In fact, I wrote an article specifically regarding tariffs back during Trump presidency 1 in Q1 of 2018 when he was talking about putting tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. And one of the examples I gave was during the Obama administration, tariffs were placed on imported tires from China. The tariff was 35% and was the result of American companies lobbying for protectionism because they could not compete with China's tire industry. Now, I will link to this article in the description box below on my website. You can check it out if you're interested in reading my thoughts 6, almost 7 years ago at this point. So the idea behind the tariff, what was intended was to protect jobs. And it did so. 1,200 jobs in the tire industry were saved as a result of the curtailing of free trade, which was great news for those 1,200 employees. If I was one of those 1,200 employees, I was happy I was able to keep my job and I didn't have to go collect unemployment or look for another job. I could stay doing what I was doing, right? Now, with that said, we just gave you an example of the $100 item and the $60 item, and then there's a 100% tariff on the $60 item, and now you're forced to pay more. That's exactly what happened with the tire business. If you needed to buy tires during that period of time, then you were either forced to pay more for imported tires from China, right? Or buy the more expensive American variety. And what happened? Well, you saved 1,200 tire industry employee jobs, but what was unintended was the cost of tires went up and the total of the cost increase over that period of time, those number of years that the tariff was in place, was $1.1 billion. Okay, so if we do the math there, that comes out to an average additional cost per job that was saved of $926,000. Okay, that's really expensive. That's a lot. That's a lot of increased costs that we had to eat to save 1,200 jobs in the tire industry. Okay. And as we talked about, it does not stop there. It continues, it gets worse. There's downstream effects, right? Because every single industry requires tires pretty much. If you have a car or a motorcycle or a bicycle for that matter, and you're getting to and from work using that means of transportation or even a public bus, right? Tires are an input in that additional cost. So what happened? It's estimated that there was 3 times the number of jobs that were lost as downstream effects as there were tire industry jobs that were saved. So we lost about 3,600 jobs, saved 1,200, spent an additional $1.1 billion. Was that the right number? 1.1 billion? Yeah, $1.1 billion, which equates to $926,000 per job. And this is somehow supposed to benefit the US economy. Now, before people say I'm too negative on this, I understand that there's nuance here, right? I'm an economics and finance guy, so I'm looking at the numbers. I don't have to take into consideration other factors like US manufacturing and what that means for the defense industry and the protection of the nation and all of those factors. I understand, right? Now, with that said, there may be other effects that are important that you have to take into consideration. And the dollars and cents of it is not the be all end all. I get that. I understand. But that's not my job to look at that. My job is to understand the numbers and to explain it to you so that you can understand the numbers and what that means for you, your pocketbook, and the costs with, running your life or running your business or whatever the case may be. So Trump plans to aggressively use tariffs to try and get US manufacturing back. Here's what that means. There's a couple of ways that this can play out, right? There's the best case scenario, there's a worst case scenario, and then there's something that's probably more likely going to happen in between. The worst case scenario is exactly what I described before. You've got 2 items, a $100 item and a $60 item. 100% tariffs or whatever percentage are put on the $60 imported item, and now you're forced to pay at least $40 more or $60 more. The cheaper option ceases to exist. All options become more expensive. Well, folks aren't really going to like that, especially when the cost of a lot of things has gone up, and a lot of people are struggling, quite frankly. With that said, the opposite end of the spectrum, and Trump does not, as far as I know, have a specific policy with regard to this, but he has mentioned it here and there, is to phase out the income tax and replace it with tariffs. Now, I don't know how that would be done logically. I don't like taxes as a general rule, and I'm willing to bet you don't either. But as the great Thomas Sowell once said, there are no solutions, there's only trade-offs. And given the option of paying income tax and paying tariffs, or paying just tariffs and no income tax, I would take the tariffs any day of the week. And here's why you should too. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm not even saying that this is likely. There's tens of thousands of IRS agents that would be out of work if the IRS ceased to exist, and I'm sure that they have some kind of pull and sway in Washington and maybe their own lobbyist group. So there's a lot of reasons, none of which are financial, that they're going to want to stay, well, financial for them, but not for you and I, right? That they're going to want to stay, continue doing what they're doing. Now, that would be great. And here's why, right? Because when you work and you earn income, you have to pay whatever the tax rate is. You can try and get around that, but the IRS frowns on that. And if you're just a regular W-2 employee, your options for committing tax fraud are very limited because that money gets pulled away before you ever see it. Now, with tariffs, here's the difference, right? There's a lot of things that you buy on a day-to-day basis that are discretionary in nature. That means you don't necessarily need them. You don't necessarily need them at all in some cases, but others you don't necessarily need them today. You can put them off into the future, right? Now, with that said, if you've got an item that you can put off into the future or avoid buying altogether, you can make that choice. The locus of control is internal at that point, right? You can say, well, money's a little bit tight, or I'm saving up for a new house, or my car needs new tires, so maybe I don't buy that discretionary item, that new big screen TV. and you kind of can control how much you play the tax game, right? You can buy less, and if you buy less and you make do with used goods, or you make the car you have last a little bit longer instead of buying a new one and paying the taxes and tariffs on that, okay, then you're in control at least a little bit as far as the tax rate that is effective to you. You can't do that with the income tax. Now, the reality of the situation is likely going to be something in between. It's unlikely. I'd love to be optimistic about this, but knowing that Washington is Washington and the speed with which it moves, it's unlikely that the IRS and the income tax is going to be abolished. Although you can certainly make an argument that it never should have been established in the first place. And believe it or not, the United States did used to function entirely off of just tariffs, right? Now, at this point, can we afford to? I don't know. I haven't crunched the numbers. Maybe, maybe not. The government is extremely bloated. We do owe a ton of money, and there's nothing that they love more than bringing in more money and wasting it. So I don't know that tariffs would necessarily be large enough, both percentage and dollar wise, in order to cover all the costs that the US government has. So I think what's likely is you're probably likely to have some tariffs in place that are going to be basically protectionist in nature. It's going to protect the steel industry or protect the tire industry or protect other manufacturing. And here's the thing, that's really only effective in the short term and the immediate term if you've got a company who's thinking about moving current US production overseas in the short term, right? John Deere is making tractors in the US, but they really want to make them in China or Mexico or Brazil or wherever. And the only thing stopping them is a large potential tariff. Okay, in that case, you're probably going to save those jobs here in the US. And the likelihood is if they had shipped those jobs over, the cost of those new tractors wouldn't necessarily go down, right? Because at this point, it's just a fatter profit margin for them. So they've crunched the numbers. They know that. What's not going to happen is it's not going to bring jobs that have already been outsourced overseas back immediately. Maybe in the longer term it will to some extent, but in the short term it certainly won't. Because if you've ever produced anything or you understand how factories or production works, it takes a lot of time to get a factory up and running. The machinery, the training of employees. It's not something that you can just snap your fingers and have it be ready tomorrow. So that's more of a longer term thing. Now, as a politician, most of them only think in terms of can I get, long term to them is can I get elected at the next cycle, right? Obviously Trump can't run for a third term because this is a second and final one. So hopefully he has, the wherewithal to think more longer term what's best for the actual country and the economy rather than what makes sense politically in the short term. So is it going to be great? Probably not. It has the potential to, and I think this is the first time in a long time that we've had a politician that's talking the way Trump has been talking regarding taxes, regarding the possibilities of cutting back or eliminating the income tax and going back to the tariffs of days of old, before the income tax was implemented in 1913. I don't think that's likely. I think there's a lot of things working against him, and I think he probably has a lot of other priorities that are certainly ahead of that in the list. Is it going to be absolutely terrible? Are the tariffs going to be huge and it's going to make everything much more expensive? Yeah, there's probably going to be some of that. Now, the extent to which that happens is difficult to say, right? And he's not really throwing all his cards down on the table. And of course, you don't want to do that if you're negotiating, which this is a negotiation, right? He is signaling to companies that we want you to produce stuff here in the US. Manufacturing has been a shrinking part of the economy for years. It's only about 7 or 8% right now, and likely to get smaller unless there are some protectionist measures in place. Now, it's not necessarily entirely clear that we necessarily want to be a manufacturing stronghold. There's some things that we probably do really well with manufacturing, and we want to hold on to those things, whether it's for national security reasons or just economic viability. But that's another story. So, there's a lot of things that go into play here. The negotiation aspect of it, I think, is important, right? Because when he goes out and says, hey, I'm going to tax foreign made cars at 100%, right? Well, Germany's going to say, well, we sell a lot of BMWs and Porsches and Audis and Mercedes in your country. We're going to sell hardly any if consumers are going to have to pay double of what they cost right now. So that's not going to work for us. What can we do to negotiate that tariff down? Or maybe we can, eliminate the tariffs that we have on General Motors and Ford and Stellantis imports into Germany, and you can sell more of your products here. So I think there's the benefit right there. If there's a realistic benefit to all of this tariff talk, the number one thing would be using it as a bargaining chip in order to get those manufacturers that are already in the United States to be able to sell more of our goods internationally and not just, be protectionist in nature. It is a little bit of a protectionist strategy there, but if you're using it as a bargaining chip and you don't actually implement the tariffs, well, then it's a win-win, right? Now you're exporting more, which is a positive, right? It's great for US manufacturing if that's what you want to do. And you don't have the negative effects, the higher costs of implementing tariffs on foreign goods coming into the country. So, with that said, hopefully you learned a little bit of something about tariffs here. It's not all, rainbows and sunshine, but it's not absolutely terrible. And the devil, as usual, is in the details. It really depends on how you go ahead and implement this thing going forward. So if you've got any questions, comments, concerns, leave them down below. My contact information and website are, as usual, in the description. Feel free to reach out. And until next time.